Okay, this is what we've done. Here's our original image. It started as a smart image, which means if we double click on it, it will reopen the original file back in Camera Raw, where we can see over here on the left, most notably, not just warmer, cooler, not just lighter, darker, or harder, softer settings, but also negative clarity to smooth the skin tones and not increase the saturation at all, because we already have such incredibly colourful colours to have to deal with here. Also, there is a fair amount of noise reduction going on, which is really important in this instance because it was shot after all at 1200 ISO, so the ability to then significantly remove that colour noise to begin with, those hundreds and thousands of colours. Once we've removed the colour noise, we then blur the granularity that's left, and we base this on the skin tone. So that's a really, really good solution. In the output down here, in the output, we clicked open in Photoshop as a smart object for the simple reason that, as we've just done, has enabled us to go back into Camera Raw in case we subsequently found out that the noise reduction was not as it should be, or we needed to change the colour temperature or do some other correction at that stage. The very first thing we did was to add a very heavy vignette. Now, remember holding down the Option key and clicking on the layer mask reveals the layer mask. So we can not only see the vignette, which of course is based on an elliptical marquee. So we created the elliptical marquee, but the elliptical marquee, of course, I mean, you've got to feather it. So you go into selection, you go into modify, you go into feather, and you just go, heaven help me, I don't know whether it's 5 or 50 or 500 pixels. So what we did is across here at the bottom of our toolbar, we clicked on the quick mask tool, editing quick mask mode, which turns a selection from these crazy marching ants into an actual picture that I can see, which means I can now see the hardness of the edge of the vignette. So I can now go in, because it's a picture, not silly marching ants, I can then go and blur with my random, Gaussian, in other words, blur. I can then go and blur the edge of that, to my heart's content. So that's basically how we created that vignette. But we noticed in creating that vignette, I'm now Option clicking to turn the image back on, we noticed that, of course, it was affecting the luminosity in your daughter's hair, and there was a few other little things that we noticed where we were perhaps dulling them down a little too much. So with a brush filled with white paint, we went back in and we started, painting some of those areas in and out, thereby helping to control that overall sense of especially your daughter, and making sure the light stays on her. Now, the second layer was a hue saturation layer. Applying a hue saturation layer, whether we did it from the shortcuts at the bottom of the layer palette or whether we come up to our layers and down to new adjustment layer, it's exactly the same thing. We've put a hue saturation. Now, the beauty of this, of course, is that we've chopped up the world of colour, the colour wheel, into 6 slices of pizza. Here are the reds, here are the yellows, here are the greens, and of course it's the dress we're looking to desaturate. So we chose the reds, and there a minus 53% reduction in saturation was what we felt was necessary. But at the same time, that significantly reduced the saturation in their skin. I've just used the Shift key to click on and off. See the big red cross? The Shift key turns off that mask. So now it's as if we haven't got a mask on at all. And you can see before and after. Yes, the dress is now coming down, and look at the detail. And yes, this is starting, but oh my goodness gracious me, the young women, their skin is really suffering. So Shift clicking back on the mask to reveal it. Option clicking on the mask to show the mask. Here, you've gone in and you've painted in back in the skin with less than 100% opacity with a black brush. I can't remember, 70% or something I think you used. So it was enough to restore enough of the colour to their skin, turn it off and turn it on, while at the same time significantly removing the red from the surrounds. And immediately by removing that red, notice over here we're also removing it from the legs of the little coffee table, and anywhere that there's any red, whether it's reflected off the dress or it's just in the daylight itself, is also being dulled down, constrained, and suddenly the image overall is beginning to take on a more cohesive appearance, like everything is starting to belong together. This led us to the next revelation. Yes, the next revelation, which was putting a photo filter on. And we chose one of the warming filters, these old Kodak Ratten filters, the light balancing filters, not the strongest, not the weakest, but one of the middle warming filters. The default strength density is 25%. We've increased that to 43% to put an increased sense of, what we saw happening when we were removing the red, we were making objects that were disparate come together and belong more as a whole, more believable. The photo filter, putting this warming colour over the image at a 43% opacity, has increased that feeling even more. The values are coming together. Yes? Now, but of course, holding the shift key and clicking on the layer mask to turn it off and on, turn it off and on, it's having too great an effect on the women and their skin. Like, while we want the warming filter to affect the background, to make the background coalesce and become more unified, we don't want the women to disappear into it. So once again, layer mask to the rescue. Again, holding down the option key and clicking on the layer mask shows us the degree, the extent to which we felt we needed to remove this effect from the young women. Very strong black blocks, black hides, and less so in other areas. But that has then resulted in, quite a wonderful sensation of how the young women belong in their own right within the room, but the room itself is now starting to shroud them, to contain them, to move around them, and it just becomes an even more dramatic but make-believe event. But then we noticed little things, like the highlights on the dress, like the extra bright light reflecting off the floor. And we put a levels adjustment up there. But notice how we adjusted the levels adjustment. In the output levels, we said, 255, pure white, it's just too bright. I need to dull down the brightest highlights. That's going to darken that area. But if we're not careful, we will also flatten that area. To the extent that the blue dress was becoming muddy, not just duller, but muddy, then we went in and adjusted our contrast slider. This is a gamma slider. It's the midpoint between black and white, so it's middle grey. So by adjusting that slider, there's where it should be, exactly halfway between black and white. But by moving it down into the shadows, we're increasing the contrast. And effectively, these pixels are now, which were darker, are now being mapped to middle grey. So we're expanding or increasing the contrast. That's effectively what it's doing. But you notice that we use the bottom slider, the highlight slider, to dull the area down. Then if the colour becomes a little muddy or flat, the right brightness but the wrong contrast, we use the contrast slider to restore that contrast. Very simple move, very powerful move. option, clicking on the layer mask, shows us where you've painted this in, on the highlights on her blue dress and the highlights on the floor. Very, very powerful indeed. And we're just dulling them down. Off, on, off, on. We're dulling them down just enough, yes, to make them sit and not poke us in the eye. All we're doing is just removing the distractions. And never forget, you can hold your fingers up to the screen and just temporarily block out areas to then remove the fingers, cover it up, remove the fingers to give you the sense of how it's going to look if that is not as bright or as prominent as it can be, just like standing in front of a painting in the National Gallery. So that is a darkening layer, where we've carefully but thoughtfully removed some of the distractions in the picture. Having done that, we then noticed other areas of distraction, that were, and we used a different technique for these. We used another hue saturation layer, because when we applied those moves to the original darkening levels layer, the effect, while perfect on the dress, while perfect on the floor, it just made this cushion totally and utterly grey and muddy. So we said what we need is a similar move, but with even more control over colour. And consequently we went to not levels, but the mighty hue saturation layer. And here you can see exactly the moves that we made. Yes, just like dragging my highlight output level slider down to the left, as we did in the previous layer, to dull it down, that's what I did. And so we've got the right brightness in the cushion now. We've got the right brightness, but it's muddy, it's dull. So we increased the colourfulness, the saturation. To, even though we're dulling it down by putting all of this grey into the cushion, we're reinstating the subtle colours that were there with a 10% increase in colourfulness. And the last thing, of course, was how we masked that in. You masked it in at 100% of the effect on the cushion, but you also felt that this young woman, and this was done subsequently, that this woman was really, well, she was competing with your daughter. Once we darkened the cushion down, we noticed that she was way too, that's not Cinderella. This is Cinderella, yes? And this is one of her handmaidens. So she's actually glowing. So, oh, well, what a perfect tool. We've already done this with the cushion. We've already dulled this down, so it's no longer poking us in the eye. So this area of the cushion now matches the rest of the settee. It appears natural. It's perfectly logical, but it doesn't poke us in the eye. And now, what are we doing? Before, after, what am I doing? We're just going to, I can't remember, it was 50% opacity, but you can see it's a middle grey. You then painted several times over this young woman in order to just lower, once again, her eye-catching appeal. And straight away, your daughter, even though you've done nothing to her, is now starting to glow. Now this is when we then started noticing, because you see how one move leads to the next move and leads to the next move. So this is a workflow where we've started at the beginning and we're adding. Well, then the next move, of course, was when we started zooming in and we started noticing, there's a few little skin blemishes there. Of course, this is Cinderella. This is a fairy tale. She has to be flawless because it's about an idealised condition. It's not the real world. And so we put a separate layer up on which, of course, we used the spot healing brush to quickly and effortlessly smooth out those areas. But we've put it on a separate layer so we can change our mind if we so desire, but also we can decide that we can change the layer opacity. We can even redo it. It's not a permanent change. So that's non-destructive editing and makes a huge difference. Just before and after makes a huge difference. Now, having done all of that, having gotten rid of distractions, having tried to get the composition in the right and proper balance, the feeling was, wow, we just need to make Cinder, this is her Night of Nights. We're just going to, I just need to put even more sparkle in her face.
Yeah.
Remember when we were cropping this image originally, changing the drawing composition, we noticed that this glass was really at the, it was a fulcrum. It was around the centre around which all other elements revolved. So one of the first things was to, put on a, now this is no ordinary unsharp mask. We had to, first of all, because, you can't really apply this to anything but an image on a layer. So we had to use the secret command, adding to the merge visible command, our new best friend, the option key. Yeah. Option merge visible doesn't flatten all of these into a single layer. It flattens and pastes them up into a new layer. Yeah. So this composite layer, which literally is all of these layers below merged into a new layer, because all of these icons were visible, they were all turned on, and consequently they were all merged into that single layer. That single layer, we then went under the filter, sharpen, unsharp mask, and this is where we applied a very special, this is successive contrast. Yeah. Remember, this is the scalloping of edges, where it's a very small amount, and it's a very broad radius. It's just putting a shadow and a highlight, diffused round edge around every other edge. And just a couple of levels of threshold to make sure we're not affecting any pimples in the skin or pores in the skin. So that, remember, there needs to be at least 2 levels of tonal difference across a boundary before that amount and that radius is applied to it. So it's really just protecting her skin. Yeah. But this is adding enormous presence to the image. Now, if I click on the layer mask and turn it off, and then turn the unsharp mask off and on, whoa, my goodness gracious me, off and on. I mean, things just pop. Yeah. This is like clarity in Lightroom, like clarity in Camera Raw. But of course, we don't want it. We've gone to all this trouble, minus clarity in Camera Raw, to smooth the skin. No, but what we want is just to put a sparkle back into specific areas. So option clicking on the mask, these are the areas, the eyes, the mouth, the earrings, and of course our crystal glass. And so turn it, and if we just zoom in here, off, on, off, on. I mean, she's just, her face just comes alive. Yeah. But while we painted it in all of her eyes, it's like putting more mascara on, more contrast into her eyes. While you paint it and put the sparkle and the dimensionality, so you can feel that earring almost spinning in space, yes? Yeah. It's animated. We only painted, yes, along the top. Just look, option clicking on the mask. We only painted along the top lip, because when you smile, the first thing that happens is your top lip comes up to spread the smile up to your eyes. If we had have applied the unsharp successive contrast mask to the bottom lip, she would have looked sadder, because it would have dragged her jaw down, yes? Which is not a joy-filled expression. So we've lifted that top of that lip just off, on. Look at the difference. Off, on, and she's really happy now. Yeah. It's her night of nights. Now, that's our move so far. Yeah. We've saved this as a Photoshop file, PSD file, so all the layers are saved with the profile we're working in embedded, so the correct colour meaning is embedded. And the last thing that we need to do is flatten all of this into a single layer and then file save as. Now, I'm not going to save it over the top, but I'll go back to my TIFF document, and I always do something like this, FINAL. So I know that this is the printing master. Okay. If I've got a series of iterations, What I also do is I would then include 03. That's the third. That would be 02.
Okay.
My .cr2 raw file would be 01. So I can see unambiguously, yes, what I've done.
Yeah.
No compression in case we send this to a lab whose
Yeah.
computers can't read compression and so forth. As raw and as pure and as pristine as I can.
Yeah.
Guess what? We have now got a complete master file that we can shrink down and put on the web, or in its finery, blow up and make an exhibition print from.
Yeah. No, that's perfect. Thank you.